Chinese is a pictographic and a tonal language. It's pictographic in the sense that the words become a symbol. And through examining those symbols and how they came to be in their modern form, you can really see some interesting things about the way that the Chinese see the world. And I'll give you my favorite and the simplest example. The character Hao, which means good, like Han Hao means I'm feeling very good. It is depicting a woman and a child together. In the grand scheme of Chinese culture, it was good to have that mother-child relationship. When you start looking at those things, you do realize how deeply there's this just kind of common core of humanity running through all of our different cultures. And it does kind of open you up to a new lens of seeing things from a perspective that is connecting us together rather than all of the forces that are driving us apart.
Welcome to Navigating Noise, the Filter Labs podcast. I'm Erol Yayboke, standing in today for Jonathan. We are super excited to have Rorry Daniels, Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. She's also a Senior Fellow at ASPE in their Center for China Analysis. She's also the host of a really excellent podcast, Asia Inside Out. In prep for this podcast episode, I was listening to some of her content there. It's really good stuff. She gets really cool people on. There was one recently with a Chinese student here in the United States, but runs the Pekingology blog, which is a great source of information. Rorry, welcome to Navigating Noise. It's so great to have you on.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the kind words about Asia Inside Out. Please do check it out.
We'll do plenty of cross promotion here. If you could start, Rorry, by telling us a little bit about you've got a awesome title at a great organization. Kind of what was your journey like getting there? And then I'd love a little bit about ASPE as well for folks who may not be familiar with your work.
My route to becoming managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute is pretty circuitous. I actually wanted, when I was a teenager and thinking about colleges, to work in the film industry. And my undergraduate degree is in screenwriting, of all things. So when I graduated from Emerson College in Boston, which is just an excellent film and TV school, I went to LA to test myself out in the industry, and found over time that it really was not a good fit for me, that I wasn't well suited to, navigating the kind of industry dynamics that were in place at the time. But I was able to find a very cool underground theater scene in LA. And over time, I ended up producing a musical about terrorism, the Gilbert and Sullivan style operetta. I'll say the name, or A Terrible Tale of Terrorists Tamed by the Tangles of True Love.
Oh, and I do love alliteration. That's great.
Yeah. And so did the writers and also the composer of this musical, Roger Neal and Julian Nitzberg. So I was in LA producing this underground musical about terrorism. It went as viral as one could get at the time. This was pre-smartphone era and really at the peak of the global war on terror. But we did end up being asked frequently by reporters that were covering the success of the musical, what were our thoughts about U.S. foreign policy, about U.S. power projection in the world, et cetera. And so in educating myself about those things, I became very interested in those dynamics. Simultaneously, I was, learning Chinese as a hobby. I've always loved languages.
As one does.
Yeah, right. As one does when they're overly ambitious and a little bored. But I love the Chinese language. And that was really my entry point, those two things, into thinking about hey, could I build a career in China studies, and particularly in international policy? We're now getting into the post-2008 era. So China had hosted the Summer Olympics. It was seen as China's major kind of coming out moment on the global stage as a truly magnificent, cultural power, but also, a time when people were recognizing the importance of China in the international policy space because of its substantial response to the global financial crisis that ended up stabilizing, being a part of the stabilization of the global economy. So all of those things fall together. And I'm in graduate school at NYU Center for Global Affairs doing a continuing ed master's degree in international relations. And I start working on a project that really approximated my skill set that I developed producing theater, which was conference-based diplomacy, or off-the-record conversations on policy topics, preparing pre-briefs and post-event reports, working, sometimes with difficult personalities or big egos, sometimes managing complex logistics of bringing together a lot of different factors and elements to make that success in the room. And eventually was able to find a job just doing exactly that. So for about 10 years, I worked in the field of track two diplomacy. And track two diplomacy is the process of bringing people together in an off the record setting to talk through policy issues where governments cannot find movement. So the things that the governments can't talk about to each other, the track two participants, which are often former officials, policy experts, even current officials in their unofficial capacity, they can kind of sit down and unpack what's behind those policy positions, address any misperceptions or misunderstandings, and then sometimes actually reframe the problem such that policy movement is possible. And I found that to be really rewarding and a good marriage of kind of the skill set that I had built in Hollywood. The skills that you have as a screenwriter, trying to take people through a journey and persuade them of something, connect with them in some way through, common experience. And then also all of the kind of logistics and management of putting together a production. And I did that in the US China space, on Taiwan, on North Korea, and other issues for about 10 years. It was deeply satisfying. Opened my network to all of the people that I now work with as managing director of ASPI. Yeah, so ASPI is the Asia Society Policy Institute. So we're part of this global nonprofit organization that is meant to build bridges between East and Western cultures. And we focus on arts and culture, policy and business, and education and leadership. So at the Policy Institute, we're looking at Asia as a region. We're looking at climate issues, trade and economic issues, energy issues as well, security and diplomacy. And we're trying to not only see how all those issues intersect with each other, which I think we'll get into a little bit later in the episode, but we're also using Asia society's convening power in arts and culture and business as well to try to bring together, important communities in order to affect policy movements toward a more sustainable, equitable, and peaceful region, and toward a better relationship between the US and Asia.
It sounds like Aspie's lucky to have you in that role. I mean, I can imagine doing what you just said requires so much cross-cultural fluency, if I could put it that way. And that 10 years doing track two definitely set you up. Also, the fact that you just, all picked up Chinese as a side hobby. This is probably like pre-apps, you actually had to like go to classes or get books at Barnes and Noble or something.
I have a wonderful Chinese teacher, Ben Wang, who was here in the city teaching at the China Institute for a number of years. And he, just an incredible human being in and of himself, was born in Western China during World War II, was eventually, his father became a key official in Chiang Kai-shek's government, moved to Taiwan, and then eventually on to the United States. But he was a scholar of Chinese etymology. And I think this really, that is a cross-cultural fluency that I think is somewhat underappreciated. Chinese is a pictographic and a tonal language. It's pictographic in the sense that the words become a symbol. And through examining those symbols and how they came to be in their modern form, you can really see some interesting things about the way that the Chinese see the world. And I'll give you my favorite and the simplest example. The character Hao, which means good, like Hao means I'm feeling very good. It is depicting a woman and a child together. And so for, in the grand scheme of Chinese culture, what was good? It was good to have that mother-child relationship, that bond. And so when you start like looking at those things, you do realize how deeply there's this just kind of common core of humanity running through all of our different cultures. And it does kind of open you up to a new lens of seeing things from a perspective that is, connecting us together rather than all of the forces that are driving us apart.
It's interesting you talked about the etymology and the pictographic nature and other unique characteristics of the Chinese language. At Filter Labs, we're a data analytics firm. We use AI tools to try to figure out how people are feeling about particular issues, but we do all of that source curation, all of the analysis, the sentiment analysis is done in the natural language using natural language processing. And it's really, really important for us in whatever language we're looking at, whether it's English and Spanish and French or Russian and Chinese, to have a really good language model that understands, like the model itself needs to understand kind of the weight given to different words.
Ah, yes. And in Chinese, this is super important.
It's super important. I know very little about. I've only been to China once, but I do remember we were there with a sort of a school group with my wife's graduate school, and some of her Chinese classmates were telling me about kind of that's not just a word. That's not just shi. That's like that means a ton. And so if you're missing that, with the AI hat on, if you're missing that nuance, then you're really probably overvaluing or underweighting or everything in between.
Yeah. And I mean, it creates major communications problems even without the use of AI. So, for example, the word in Chinese for publicity and propaganda is the same. And so, if you can interpret it one way or another. And in the United States in English, those are two very different connotations, right? So I think it's a, the type of language models that you need to have to be that specific and that nuanced. And it's a constant challenge, especially with Chinese, which is not well suited for thinking up new words to find the way that these things fit together. So for example, computer, Diannao is electric brain, right? Because China doesn't come up with a completely new word. It puts words together in different ways to make the same meaning. So these are all things that have like really drawn me in about Chinese culture. And that's just like the surface level. There are the kind of the standard idioms and the classic literature, all of the beautiful and deep parts of Chinese civilization that frankly, I wish I had more time to dive into, but are underexplored from my perspective.
And there's, a wide internet out there. It sounds like you go to China pretty often. So, look forward to keeping in touch and learning by osmosis some of what you're garnering. I want to turn us to, look, we're lucky to have you on at a particularly weird time, maybe, or maybe it's not a particular, maybe the weirdness between US and China that we're experiencing at the geopolitical level is there's more weirdness than normal relations. I don't know, you tell me, but um, helping our listeners at a higher level, I do want to get into sort of what the internet looks like and how we think about data there. But I feel like to go there, first we have to go to kind of what's the high level analysis of what this moment is right now. What are we feeling? We're talking about great decoupling and some other things. You understand China better than most, almost anybody that I know, if not anybody that I know. And so try to explain sort of what's going on and what do we get wrong when we're looking at China? Yeah, like we understand the US sort of. I mean, the current president, it's hard to understand anything going on, in his head. He knows theoretically what's going on. But like from a Chinese perspective, what are we missing?
What's the big picture? I mean, the big picture is that we may actually be living in normal times. And what might have been strange was that the US and China were so invested in cooperation and communication for a period of years when the power between the two was really asymmetrical. and the US was trying to draw China into the global trading and economic system for, I think, pretty selfish reasons. I mean, our system of global geoeconomics depends on developing countries being drawn into the system. It depends on labor arbitrage and wage arbitrage and manufacturing moving out of the United States or moving to automation. It's the efficiencies of the global system get unlocked when you have a diversity of economies participating in it.
Yeah, and the rules, like they, agreed upon set of rules that, oh, by the way, benefit us.
Right. That too. And that's a huge source of contention for the Chinese, is that they were drawn into a system where they were not allowed to make some of the rules and they find some of them unfair. And we could unpack that in greater detail. But what underpinned that as well, and I think the way that this was sold to the American public, perhaps the American elites, was that not only did we need to do this for our own economic purposes, but also doing so would ensure a safer, more secure world, because countries that trade with each other tend to converge in their political systems. They tend not to go to war with each other. And so there was this underlying expectation as China entered the global international and financial and trading system that it would liberalize its politics and end up looking more like the United States. And when when it became clear that that assumption was incorrect, that it was not going to pan that way, that China actually had considerable political control inside its country to manage from a state-directed model, and that not only did it want to manage its economy continuously from a state-directed model, that there were limits to reform and opening, that it would also ensure that the party state stayed strong in the political culture, that it remained able to, kind of manage dissent, sometimes through really kind of brutal means. So when all of those assumptions came under pressure in the 2010s, I would say, then people started really looking at China differently. And anxiety, I think anxiety from the United States perspective goes along several different spectrums. There's an anxiety that China will simply outcompete us economically. I mean, that's anxiety number one, is that, the United States will be in a disadvantageous position in the global economy because China has the scale, the resources, the people, and the drive and the technical ability to out-innovate and outcompete the United States. And for a country like the United States that has been number one in the world for a very, very long time, there's a substantial amount of people and industries and entities in the United States that don't want to see that change. So that's anxiety number one. Anxiety number two is that even though the assumption that political systems converge with greater economic activity between states was proven not to be true in case of China, we still believe it's true. So we still believe that if China outcompetes us economically and builds ties with other countries in the world through their trading system, those countries will end up looking more like China. And we're worried about a world in which that's the case, right? Because there's been so much invested in ensuring that, the US model is exportable to other countries, that it's, that other countries are drawn to it. And then that wasn't enough. I mean, that is enough. But if that weren't enough, yeah, I mean, there's human rights embedded in that too. Like, what is China's record on human rights? China has its own perspective on US record on human rights, which is, I think, they're not equatable, but they're both valid.
I remember when Secretary of State Blinken was in Alaska. I think this got brought up. It was sort of Black Lives Matter, and they brought. It was very early in the Biden administration. I was not in government at that point, but I distinctly remember the Chinese bringing up. It felt like whataboutism to me, but it definitely they were not letting the U.S. get off just by dropping the Xinjiang bomb and then, moving on.
And I agree. There is some whataboutism, I think, there for China. I think the U.S. has tried as best as possible to at least be transparent about how its systems of power, at least until recently, it's been very transparent about how its systems of power have systemically oppressed classes of people. And maybe that's the best you could ever ask for. I mean, is there a system of power that doesn't create winners and losers? As long as you can be transparent about it, that's good. I would put the onus of the United States on human rights more in the camp of like what governments are we supporting overseas, what interventions have we made militarily that perhaps from our perspective were national security priorities but wouldn't have lived up to our own human rights standards. You hear less of that from China because for lots of reasons. Anyway, so those two things are maybe enough, but what we also have is a legacy international system where the US has committed to defend our allies and partners overseas through treaties. I mean, these are legally binding documents that say if our allies are attacked, that we have an obligation to come to their aid and defense. And what we see is that because of the way that the Cold War worked, a lot of our allies and partners are on China's periphery. So we have the Republic of Korea, formal treaty ally. We have Japan, formal treaty ally. We have the Philippines, a formal treaty ally. We have Thailand as a former treaty ally. We have Australia, though somewhat, more removed than people realize, still a treaty ally. And so, and then we have significant defense in partnerships with other geographies, localities in the Indo-Pacific, including Taiwan. So, and China is coming to its international power with a narrative that's very salient inside its own country, a post-colonial narrative that says for years China's territory has been chopped up, divided, subjugated by colonial powers. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest this, especially in the Qing dynasty, that China was also, systematically exploited by colonial powers. And what China needs to do in order to rectify for justice for those past atrocities is complete its territorial integrity. Rebuild the country as it was. And the problem is that China claims territory that directly contradicts claims with US allies and partners. So we also have a military competition going on that is a direct result of our relationships with other allies and partners. And that's a competition that I think is being very much played out actively in the moment. It's probably where the biggest flashpoints hold. And now it's been enwrapped over the last 8 years in the economic piece of the competition because many of our tech supply chains run in and through these countries. So when it comes to Taiwan, you've got your advanced chip design and manufacturing, Korea, leader in smartphone technology, shipbuilding, et cetera. Japan has significant industrial and manufacturing capabilities. Got India as a rising player. We've still got all of our business with China and the equipment that it assembles. But as we're increasingly looking at the world through the lens of technological competition, because advances in technology create advantages on in the military space and in the economic space, then we're also seeing all of these different factors kind of play out together in new and increasingly complicated and compounding ways. A number of other kind of trends and drivers are leading us to uncharted territory because the US and China are the number one and number two economies in the world, but it's not like there's a rising number three. Like everyone else is so far down the list that there's no way to create a balance of power against the US or China without using the other.
Well, especially when Europeans can't really agree on anything, that was one of the early visions for the EU, right? Is that it could be at least some sort of balance giving entity, but
very difficult to see how that would come about at this point. Although it's interesting, maybe US pressure on the EU will actually cause it to congregate a little bit more closely. So you have that dynamic. And then you also have the, which I think is equally concerning to non-US and Chinese countries, the rest of the world. You also have a two major powers, the two most major powers, biggest powers in the world, that seem to think the rules-based international system no longer serves their interests. And they're really looking for a power-based international system where they're able to use all of the tools of leverage, whether it's political, economic, security, military tools, in order to advance their own national interest in a prioritization that, you know, their leadership has decided. And without regard to some of the rules that have constrained power of a particular country or of one country in the past in order to create bigger global public goods. So I see the US and China right now as looking increasingly like each other in the Trump administration, which is concerning, I think, should be concerning for the rest of the world. But it might be a reversion to the mean. It might actually be that the kind of Pax Americana that started after World War II, that was underpinned by this rules-based system, that was underpinned by a very reluctant superpower in the United States that said, we don't want to use our power coercively because we don't want to really deal with the responsibility of managing the entire world. Let's set up this system where we share, where we cooperate, where we agree together on what the rules of the road are. And people can come along or not. And there are it took a long time to integrate the whole world into that system. But ultimately it was done through the restraint of a major power, of a unipolar power, the only major power in the world. And we just don't see that anymore. But that's much more like the world as it was pre-World War II.
And honestly, China itself did benefit from that system. I'm thinking of, the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank still lend to China even to this day, and have for years. So I think there's certainly like an update to the international system that I think is overdue, and I'm not sure that anybody even within the international system would disagree with that. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement, but I think this sort of getting tough on China as a means to update or tear down, or I don't know what, the international system is certainly, we find ourselves certainly in a moment. I wanted to talk a little bit. So at Filter Labs, we've been doing a little bit of work on. We've got really good China data, and we are able to disaggregate between sort of what we broadly call Chinese social media and then more official sources. You mentioned territorial integrity, so we're looking at the South China Sea as one example, and what we're starting to see is sort of early indications that there are differences in online between sort of how Chinese, I guess we can call netizens, feel about particular issues versus the CCP and the sort of CCP driven online narratives. And so, where would you see first of all, do you see a difference there from your travels there, from your conversations with folks? And if you do, like, what are the biggest areas of convergence and maybe even divergence or dissonance between those two, kind of like the Chinese people and then the organs of the state?
On the question of how people are viewing the South China Sea, I'm not totally sure. And I'd be curious, like, does your data show that netizens are more nationalistic on the South China Sea or more measured?
We're seeing some early indications of the former, quite frankly. Like, there's some Chinese social media that is a little bit more on the nationalistic sort of rah-rah side. Interestingly, we also saw, with regards to President Trump and tariffs, there's this weird string of, I call it weird. It's in the data. It's maybe not weird. It is what it is. But it's this string of folks who, eh, maybe it's like a begrudging acceptance of what Trump is doing. Like, they sort of get like, oh, the U.S. has set up the system, and like, has, maybe it's been uneven. People are slapping tariffs on other on U.S. goods, but then the U.S. is not doing. And so, like, there's this sort of acceptance of like, yeah, we don't love it, but like we kind of get it. and so there's an interesting sort of thing happening in that space. But to answer your question, it's we're starting to see early indications, I think, of a sort of a nationalistic trend.
That doesn't surprise me. I think that for the most part, people who go to the internet to make their opinions heard. I mean, I think what we hear on the internet is so often reflective of the extremes of our societies, and not, nobody goes on the internet to say, I had a really nice day today. I ate a sandwich. They go to say, you wouldn't believe what happened to me at the sandwich shop. They put a rat in it or whatever, so it's always the extremes that kind of get amplified on social media. And I think that's as much the case in China as it is anywhere else. Like people, and I think this is where, I spend a lot of my time thinking kind of philosophically, is the behavioral piece of interacting online. Like people go to social media to feel something, to react in some way. I do worry that we are creating ecosystems across the world where, adrenaline and cortisol and like releasing that kind of anger impulse has been addicting for people, very addicting for people. And it's causing them to behave now in their IRL in real life and in more aggressive ways. But anyway, and so I would just say that China's not so different. That's also happening there. What maybe is a little bit less available to understand from an outsider's perspective is that Chinese people are at once very proud of the government of China over decades for lifting the country out of extreme poverty. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. It's actually extraordinary how much change China has absorbed in the last 40 or 50 years. At the same time, I've rarely met people who are more cynical about their government. They know that like there are eye-rolling aspects to the party state. That there is this like underlying power dynamic that is underpinned by a cultural tradition saying, hey, you know what, like it, broadly speaking, and I hate shortcutting this, but I'll do it anyway, that like the collective, the sense of societal stability is more important than your individualistic wants and needs. So both of those, like all of those things are playing out at once, and it turns into at once, like it can be quite humorous at times, right? The way that Chinese people go about circumventing the state propaganda and state surveillance apparatus by, finding new words in Chinese to say the same thing. One kind of consistent part of miscommunication and misperception between the US and China is a deep understanding of the Chinese political atmosphere and culture at any given moment. So like what topics are trendy, what topics are forbidden, who's up, who's down. There's a lot of reading between the lines, and I've yet to meet a Western analyst who comes even close to like just someone who's lived in China for 30 years at decoding that type of stuff. And so we're often like, I remember being in a meeting with a very, very prominent sinologist and, Western sinologist. And our Chinese interlocutor was like, it's like you're reading this through a funhouse mirror. Like you're right. Like that's the basic image, but you've kind of twisted the contours of it in a way that makes no sense to me. And I think that if even someone who's that deeply read in Chinese philosophy and society and language and culture and spent that much time talking to Chinese interlocutors can't read that right, we'll really never be able to do that from the outside. We'll have to rely on our Chinese friends and partners to help us decode the political atmosphere.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because one of the things we do at Filter Labs is, we've got all this data, but we ask it questions, we query it, and the query process involves trying to always be up on what those code switches are. We see this a lot in the Russian information environment. People trying to circumnavigate, and obviously in China, they're trying to not only not get in trouble, they're trying not to have their stuff taken down, right? Like they're circumnavigating the censors in a way. So that's really interesting. I want to talk about in the last couple minutes that we have what looking forward. You and I are both sitting on the East Coast of the United States currently, but setting aside U.S. China or foreign relations from a Chinese perspective, what's on the horizon for China? Like if I'm a Chinese netizen sitting in interior China somewhere, what am I, sure, I'm watching Trump and all that stuff every once in a while, but like what am I caring about? What am I watching? What's coming for me?
I think what China wants, what it wants to be coming for it, is really to lead a new era of modernity that incorporates technology into all aspects of society and culture. I mean, I don't think that's just like the wish of the state for economic reasons, et cetera. I think that the Chinese conception of itself as a civilization, a society, a state, all of those things really lends back to a history of being a first mover and a model for other countries in being being modern. And so I think what's coming for China is a period of and it's already been coming. It's in a period of intense experimentation. And there's plenty that the state can do to drive that. It can drive it through policy levers. It can drive it through resources. It can drive it through regulations. It can drive it through partnerships. But there's also plenty to constrain it along the way, right? So, it matters that for China to be seen as truly the most modern society and culture, not necessarily the biggest global power, but the most modern society and culture, other countries will have to want to adopt its style, whatever that looks like.
You talked about a future that's really kind of tech heavy. They want to be the most advanced technology. I'm thinking South Korea, like or Singapore or something like that. So I'd be remiss, we're a company, our URL is filterlabs.ai. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you how you saw AI fitting into that picture, and maybe even just zooming out to the region. Like, this is all pretty new for all of us. How do you see kind of AI diffusion across the region? What are some of the pitfalls and opportunities maybe that are coming?
I think AI has incredible power to be beneficial to society. And there's a number of like already use case applications. I had a fellow on my podcast last year who Vilas Dar, who's the head of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And he was telling me about a use case where a village in India used Raspberry Pi, like a very non-complex computer system, fits in your hand, smaller than a cell phone, very simple switch mechanism. But using AI, they were able to program a series of lights around a jungle to keep elephants from trampling their crops and people. And like, hey, that's a great use of AI, and it's community-based. It's wonderful. On the other hand, I think that what we probably fail to recognize and realize is that integration of AI into our economies and societies for the behavioral reasons and to unlock economic efficiencies is going to create a massive amount of change in domestic economies and in the global economy. And periods of change tend to be risky situations for political developments. So like as a simple analogy, and probably not a perfect one, look at the hollowing out of American manufacturing over the last 60 years. So we think from like 1950 to today, or 1960 or so to today, manufacturing went from something around like 53% of the US economy to what it is now. It's about 8, conservative estimate, it's about 8% of the US economy. And a lot of that some of it's due to international labor arbitrage, some of it's just due to automation and technological improvements. And that produced Donald Trump, right? Like a person who I think I can diplomatically say is a nonpartisan think tank professional that he's reactionary, right? That he is very focused on returning the United States to a former, what he sees as like former glory, a glorious past. And that was a movement that came up over, 50 or 60 years. The amount of change that AI is going to produce in economies, is going to dwarf that, I think, significantly. And it's going to happen so much faster. It could happen as fast as 5 or 10 years from now that we're seeing just massive changes in the labor market. Even over 50 years, the United States, the most technologically advanced economy in the world, with an open, democratic, bottom-up pressure political system, couldn't manage that rate of change in its economy. What is going to happen in, the emerging economies, let's say of Southeast Asia or South Asia, when many of the jobs that they have been training their workforce for, to take over simple service sector jobs from the United States and other countries are outsourcing, whether that's call center or, building a spreadsheet, doing some basic paralegal research. When all of those go AI, like what actually happens to those economies and what kind of changes in the political system does that produce? On the other hand, if you look at the research on technological revolutions or, over time, let's say we're in the fourth industrial revolution, what has been transformative for countries has been to adopt quickly. So over time, the research shows that countries that came in with the strongest advantage on a new technology, they invented the steam engine, for example, didn't necessarily accrue the greatest economic and social benefit from that invention. It was the countries that diffused it the quickest, that adopted it the fastest, that ultimately ended up winning the industrial revolution race, if you can put it that way. And so there are some competing pressures here. On the one hand, like the data says, adopt as quickly as possible, leapfrog your economy, et cetera. On the other hand, the faster you have to absorb that pace of change, the more likely you are to have just an incredibly volatile political and social environment, right? What needs to happen probably is a couple of things. One is that this is like the Wild West in AI regulation and adoption, and a global conversation is taking place through the auspices of the UN, but perhaps could be driven even more quickly at a regional level. And Asia has some first movers in this space. Singapore has a really excellent set of an AI roadmap for how they want to integrate AI into their economy and society. South Korea has recently come up with legislation about governing the use of AI. But the countries and centers of excellence that are popping up, the AI safety institutes that deal with the trust issue, like can you trust AI? Is it leading us down a correct path or a useful, beneficial path? They're not talking to each other yet. And so one thing that I'm incredibly passionate about that I would like Asia Society Policy Institute to be a main driver of is convening that conversation, looking for best practices, looking for use cases that have been particularly important, and otherwise tracking how deep and wide and fast is this diffusion of AI into Asian economies, and what, if anything, can we predict about the eventual political figures that will, come out of this, and their impact on, security, sustainability, and prosperity for the region.
Well, it sounds like we all need to be refreshing the ASPE website. And I personally and professionally look forward to following that conversation. Really, really important. Rorry, you have been incredibly generous with your time and sharing all of your wealth of knowledge with us. This is a really fun conversation. Everyone should go and subscribe to Asia Inside Out. It's an excellent podcast. Rorry, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
This was fun. Thank you so much for having me.